Hello, welcome back to FM Live. My name is Mike Usrey, and today we're going to be talking about eccentric bolts and alignment cams and Paco eccentric locks, if I can even spit it out. So let's go ahead and I'll show you some of the parts, because this is going to be one of those conversations that I think a lot of people probably have a little bit of an idea of what's going on, but not really knowing what exactly the problem might be. So I'm going to start kind of at the top, and we'll work our way down through the questions and why you might want a lock or why you may need to update your hardware so that way you don't have issues. So before we get started with all this, of course, if you do have questions about this topic, feel free to drop those in the comments below. I'll try to address some of the comments and some of the questions along the way if we have time. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So, eccentric or alignment bolts. I'm sure that you've probably heard of them. What does that even mean? We're talking about these guys. So this is a bolt with a funny looking bib on it, and that allows it to move in kind of a concentric circle when we do our alignment. And when we're talking about these eccentric or alignment bolts, we're talking about them in relation to our subframe. Here we have some relatively crusty front subframe from an NB, I think, here in front of me. And we're just going to use it for some demo, but generally speaking, these guys are going to be like that. That may help them look a little bit more familiar if you've ever been underneath your car. But these guys, they'll pass through bushings, control arm bushings that are captive within a control arm. And so you can actually move them around. Now, obviously, they don't normally move like this whenever they're installed, but when things are loose, and just for a demonstration here, you can see that as I move it around, it's actually moving this bushing in and out, because this is a slotted hole. So turning this bolt around basically is it's rotating around on this cam plate, and it's moving the bolt in and out. So that way you can move the control arm here, and there'll be one back here, in and out. So that way you can make changes to how far out, how far back this lower control arm is, and that is how you effectively change your alignment. And this is a NA or NB looking subframe, but the process is pretty much the same for NCs and NDs as well on the front. Rears are a little bit more complicated when we start talking about NCs and NDs, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But effectively, you have 8 of these on your Miata, and they are going to be on only the lower control arms, both 2 on this side, 2 on that side, so 4 in total in the front, and then 4 on the back. And that's how your alignment tech makes your alignment changes as necessary anytime you do go in for an alignment job. So these guys also, from the factory, there's actually a little washer that's also an eccentric, or I guess you could call it a concentric plate, and it follows the other one as well. So you'll have one on the back and one on the front of your control arm when it passes through like that. So this is a pretty normal setup. This is what your car would have from the factory. Now, what we're talking about today are going to be these little guys. So these are the Paco Eccentric Locks, and we'll talk about, one, why they're so different from your traditional cam plate, and 2, what benefits they have for a car that is possibly driven hard with sticky tires and very stiff suspension. So, without further ado, let's talk about these guys. These are, in essence, the same thing, or they do the same job as these cam plates, but they do it with a locking mechanism. So they're 2-piece, and these guys will fit over. Well, here you will start with just the little alien head. You'll start with that, but when this guy gets put into position, this kind of funny egg-shaped piece, it locks into the teeth here on the alien head, so that way it can hold it in position relative to your subframe. So to show you in situ, rather than having this on here like it normally would. We would take this guy off, put our little alien head on here, and then the little egg-shaped piece. And now, because of this outer shape here, I can't actually really rotate this much. It'll wiggle a little bit, but I can't make this wiggle and move around like I can with the stock eccentric cam, because this will actually allow it, oops, I need to put this on the same way as the other side. This will actually allow it to rotate because it's completely round all the way, whereas this egg shape locks it in place. So, why is that important? Why is this even a thing? Why do you need a lock there? So, these little guys, they are preventing that cam, that eccentric bolt, from moving around. And that is a thing because if you have a Miata that has, generally speaking, not always though, big sticky tires, usually some stiff sway bars or suspension, and it's driven hard, usually at a track or autocross, you're putting lots of forces through the control arm into the subframe and these eccentric bolts. And when that force is pushing, pulling, especially on the very front two eccentrics on your front subframe, there are lots of forces that are basically trying to rip that eccentric bolt out of place or trying to at least shift it out of place. So if you've ever driven your Miata in anger on the track or autocross, and you're driving along, doing all your corners, and all of a sudden you feel a thunk, and then your steering wheel suddenly is a little bit off center whenever you drive off track and it's no longer straight up and down, you actually have a little bit of cant to it. That's because your eccentric has slipped, because all of that force has either pushed or pulled your eccentric out of place, even though you generally will have a nut on here to keep it tight and in place when it's all put back together after the alignment shop visit. That happens. The most susceptible one for this to happen to is the front eccentric bolts on your front subframe. Because of the shape of the lower control arm, most of the force actually is transferred through the front eccentric, and the rear eccentric, it does see some force, but nowhere near as much as the very front eccentric bolt. So typically, if it's going to happen that you get a slipping eccentric bolt, it's usually that front on the front subframe. But that'll happen, and with this round cam plate from the factory, it can be more likely to happen because the only thing preventing that from happening is this locking nut. And you can get these guys pretty tight, and you may even try over tightening them to be able to get as much clamping force as possible to keep things together. And sometimes that works, but it doesn't always work. So rather than having issues with your stock eccentric cam slipping, if you install these guys and lock it in place, now, because of the shape of that outer piece, there really isn't going to be any possible way for it to slip or move. It can wobble a little bit, and again, this is loose, this isn't tightened up, but it can't make any significant movements like a round piece can, because this is physically keeping it from slipping within the confines of the tabs on either side of the plate. So let's take a step back. This is a little bit deep. Why, or whom might need this kind of a technology? Now, granted, this is not for everybody. Not everybody is going to need these, because this is something that you're going to experience if you're really driving the car hard and you have big sticky tires, modified suspension, yada, yada, yada. So a lot of people, this is possibly overkill. And these are something that, for most people, if you don't have experience with them, can be a pain to deal with as well. Because if you are installing these, either you need to install them before you go to the alignment shop, or you need to have them do a normal alignment for you with the stock cam plates And then when you get home, you can try installing them after the fact, as long as you're careful not to move the bolt itself. There's a little bit of risk involved, but basically either way there's added time, because you'll need to make sure that you can get this lined up where it's supposed to go. Because just like the stock cam plate, these guys have little teeth on the top and the bottom on the face. And so if this is turned here, you do need to make sure that this is turned in such a way that whenever your locking plate is in position up or down like that on the subframe, that you can actually get it in position. That's why there are multiple teeth here on the outside ring versus the little alien face. So that way you can effectively change the orientation of your alignment bolt via this little locking interface of the 3 little teeth. Another thing that this guy does, if you find that you're running out of range, essentially, is that you can actually flip the little guy over. So now the teeth are on the other side. So if you need more range and it feels like you're out of range, so I need to keep spinning it like that, you can just flip the guy over. Oh look, now the teeth are on the other side. So there is a little bit extra range and adjustment built into this. But either way, it does require a bit of fiddling to be able to get it to where your alignment is where you want it to be with these locks in place. So if it's not for everybody, what other compromises do we have to worry about with this kind of a style of a locking plate? So because it is a locking plate and it does have teeth in it, these teeth, I don't recall what the specific degree separation is on them, but they are not an infinite amount of adjustment like a round cam plate is. There is a little bit of granular adjustment to them. So you won't be able to hit your target of exactly negative 2.37 degrees camber. You may have to settle for negative 2.4 degrees, within a very, very small window. There is some granularity involved that you cannot overcome because it is not a round cam plate like the stock piece is. But besides that, as long as you understand what you're trying to do with these locks as far as getting them to lock in place, they effectively achieve the same job, and they'll keep it from slipping because they can't. It's not a round shape. That's really the goal here. So, don't want to overskip some of the questions that we had here that are relevant. Let's back up here for just a second. One of the main questions that we got about these was, are these cams for everybody? And I kind of touched on that earlier, but really the answer is no. They're not for everybody. And I would say that specifically because if you've not been driving hard on the track and you haven't felt that clunk and then all of a sudden your steering wheel is off a little bit, you may not need these. You probably aren't driving aggressively or don't have quite enough sticky tires or whatever the case is for your eccentric bolt to actually slip under load. So if that's the case, what you have right now is working. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that there are multiple styles of this that does affect, oops, I'll get that in a second, that does affect how effective this is. So let's talk about the comparisons of the early style versus the latter style of the eccentric bolt, because this is an important fact if you're using the locks or not. This one is an earlier style from the 90s eccentric bolt, and this basically has a D shape on it, and you can see the cam plate also has a D shape. Whereas the newer style, it's actually got these two slots that are 180 degrees apart, or an H shape. So the difference between these two can be summarized basically just in how the bolts are cut. Generally speaking, the D-shape earlier style bolts, if you're going to have issues with so much load causing them to strip, the D-shape is slightly more prone to stripping out. It's still quite tough to make this have an issue where it would actually strip the bolt and the cam plate separately from each other. But the other factor is that on this newer style cam plates versus the older style cam plates, is that they're actually quite a bit thicker. So hopefully you can see that in the video, but these earlier style ones are a thinner cam plate than the newer style ones, and these are both factory. These aren't aftermarket or anything like that. So just upgrading to the newer style H or double slotted cam bolts and cam plates is a pretty good upgrade on its own, because oftentimes if you have the older cam plates and if you've been to the alignment shop multiple times, you'll actually have wear along the outside of your cam plates. And usually that's what causes these guys to slip. Because when they're in here, they're only retained by these two little tabs, one on the inside, one on the outside. So if this cam plate is worn enough that the edges are rounded or have been basically chewed up enough, then you're going to get a little bit more slop, and it's going to be more likely for it to rotate on you when you don't want it to. Compared to the newer ones, because it just has so much more meat on that cam plate, it takes more time for it to wear down, and it has better engagement with these tabs on the inside and the outside, that you're less likely, or it's going to take more time and more wear for that to become a problem, just because it's the newer style with the thicker cam plates. So a lot of you that are just running around on the street, you may not need to go as far as getting the locking plates, but a lot of times just upgrading your eccentric bolts to this newer style is a big improvement. Over time, these guys do get worn down, and you could actually over-tighten this enough to where you're stretching the threads on the bolt. And when you do that, then basically as the bolt is being pushed and pulled around, tensioned under load, it will come loose even easier than if the bolt didn't have if it's not been overstressed and over-pulled to the point where the bolt is actually a weaker metal at that point. So if you are still running around with these original D-shape eccentric bolts, the easiest upgrade is just get new hardware. But if you're running around the track, and especially if you already have the newer hardware, say if you have an NB, if you already have this from the factory, it might not be a bad idea to get the eccentric locks. Basically, you can think of these as added insurance on top of the NB or the later style eccentric bolts. Really, that's how I would consider them. Personally, if I am going to run them on a car, I will start off with only two. As I've already mentioned, the front two eccentric positions on the front subframe are the most likely to slip. So if I'm going to do it, I'll usually start with just the front two. If you notice that you're having issues with any of the other cam plates actually slipping, the stock ones slipping and moving around, then you could go back and add more. But the downside at the alignment shop, or if you do this yourself after the fact, is that trying to do each one of them takes a little bit of time. So unless you want to have a 2 or 3 hour visit to the alignment shop, which I've done, unless your alignment guy is really friendly and doesn't mind, that will be one, a much bigger bill to the alignment shop, but two, a lot more hassle than it might be worth if you're not slipping the other cam bolts on the other 7, or rather 6 positions on your front and rear subframes. So I think that we've covered most of the questions that we had about this at the moment. So I'll stop here and ask, do we have any other questions that I haven't covered? Nothing at the moment? Okay. Well, I hope that this is mostly clear. I think that this is one of those topics that it's hard to understand if you aren't looking at the parts and pieces. But in the end, we're just talking bolts and fancy washers is more or less all this is. So you can have issues with the stock hardware. Hopefully, if nothing else, this conversation has prompted you to go take a look, see what kind of eccentric bolts you have. All of these parts, well, except for the old stuff, all of the parts, the eccentric locks, and even new stock NB style eccentric hardware, or a combination of both where you get a new eccentric bolt, nut, and the locking cam plate, can be found on our website. So if you need to replace your eccentric bolts and or get some locking hardware, we do have these available. We'll put some links down below so that way you can access them and get a hold of them now. But otherwise, I hope that this was something that you guys learned something from. If you have more questions about it, we are more than happy to help. you can reach out to us via email at support@flyinmiata.com, give us a call, send us a chat message on Facebook, Instagram, you name it. There's all kinds of ways to get a hold of us nowadays, which is awesome. But hopefully this is something that if you have any other questions about, you can reach out to us and we'll get you sorted out. But that's it, I think, for today. We'll leave it there. And as always, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any other topics that you'd like for us to cover in the future, put those in the suggestion comments down below, so that way we can see what would you like to talk about. Is there any other things that you want to learn? Maybe I haven't talked enough about control arm bushings. Actually, we have several videos about that, so we'll put some links to those down below too. But if you'd like to hear about anything else, let us know. We'd love to share some more information with you. Thanks again for your attention, and we will see you all next time.